Hi everyone. If you're just logging in now, we'll give it a couple of minutes to let a few more people get logged in. I can see that the ticker's going, so we'll start just after 1 o'clock. Hi everyone. If you're just joining us, we'll just give it a couple of minutes to let everybody get logged in. I can see that there are lots of participants joining just now. Brilliant. Well, hi everyone and welcome to today's CIPR Scotland event on ethics. I'm Sean Bell and I'm chair of the CIPR Scotland. It's really brilliant to have you with us today. If you aren't familiar with the CIPR Scotland, we bring together a community of more than 600 professionals working in the industry, and we're here to support you with your CPD. Today's event is worth 5 CIPR CPD points and they can be logged on our CPD website. You can also join in the debate today on Twitter using hashtag CIPR Scotland events. Now we are recording today's session and a link to that will be made available afterwards. Because this month the CIPR is supporting Global Ethics Month, which encourages communications professionals around the world to think about the importance of ethics in our everyday professional practice. The CIPR has just launched 4 new playbooks which support your practical knowledge of ethics alongside a series of tools and techniques to improve your skills in decision making. These playbooks are completely exclusive for CIPR members and they focus in on 4 key themes, which are fact-checking, ethical decision making, regulation, and reflective ethical practice. Next week, the CIPR will also be launching a new workbook on data literacy skills as well. Today, though, we are talking about ethics in practice, and I'm sure that we all know upholding ethics when communicating is vital, whether that's in business, government, non-profit, or the public sector. But what does that actually mean in practice? Well, in today's event, we'll be exploring what ethical considerations we should be thinking about when creating campaigns, working across social media and media channels, representing clients, or speaking with politicians as well. And I'm really delighted that we're joined today by a brilliant expert panel who can talk us through this. I'd like to introduce Izzy Crawford, who is Academic Strategic Lead within the School of Creative and Cultural Business at Robert Gordon University. And also Billy McLaren, the Lobbying Registrar at the Scottish Parliament, and his colleague James Drummond, who's Assistant Lobbying Registrar. In a moment, I'll hand over to Izzy, Billy and James to introduce themselves and their work on this important issue. But if you have any questions for our panel, we will be having a Q&A throughout this session. So you can use the function at the bottom, either the Q&A button or the chat button, and we'll try to get through as many questions as possible in the session. But to kick things off, Izzy, I wonder if you can kick us off with an introduction to you and your fascinating work at RGU.
Thank you, Sean, and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining in the session today. So as Sean said, my name is Izzy Crawford and I'm an academic strategic lead in the School of Creative and Cultural Business at Robert Gordon University, Aberdeen, and I've been here since 2005, and my main role is as a senior lecturer in public relations. So I teach ethics on the undergraduate and postgraduate PR courses, both of which are CIPR recognised. So we try to adhere very strongly to the CIPR ethical principles in what we teach. I'm also a course leader for the CIPR Specialist Diploma in Crisis Communications, so needless to say, ethics plays a big part in that. Prior to being a lecturer, I worked for the NHS in Grampian as a communications manager, and not surprisingly, ethics was a huge part of my day job when I worked there too. So more recently, I'm involved in some research, which is on the topic of collaborative online international learning. And one of the big themes that we try and adopt as part of those activities is ethics, but also related topics like sustainability and corporate social responsibility as well. So ethics cuts across everything I do.
Brilliant. Thank you, Izzy. Billy, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what the lobbying registrar does at the Scottish Parliament.
Yes, thank you, Sean, and thank you, everybody. So my post was to set up a small team in the Parliament to deliver, it's actually Scottish Government legislation passed by the Parliament in 2016, and that was the Lobbying Scotland Act. And that was to regulate certain forms of lobbying. So that meant for us, James joined me very quickly after it, that meant procuring, developing and delivering an online register, and then working very closely with all sectors that would be involved with the register before it legally came into force, which was in March 2018. So, and in fact, the CIPR were one of the organisations that were on our working group, which helped us to develop some pragmatic parliamentary guidance from that legislation for stakeholders. And since the register went live, which is almost 4 years ago now, the team has been focusing on providing users with assistance, dealing with compliance issues and engaging in outreach work such as today. And we'll also offer advice to committees and other parts of the Parliament from time to time.
Brilliant, thank you, Billy. And James, I don't know what your perspective is. It sounds like you've been in from pretty much the start as well, but what's your perspective on the importance of the lobbying register?
Hi, Sean, thank you. Yeah, I've pretty much been in from the start, followed soon after Billy. But in answer to your question about the importance of the lobbying register, I think it's, in a nutshell, the transparency that it provides. I mean, more than ever, I think people, the public, they want to know who politicians are engaging with and about what matters. I mean, we don't see it too much here in Scotland, but we've all seen and read recently about lobbying that's taken place in Westminster, outcry of ex-prime ministers using their influence to get the ear of policymakers. So it's not to say that there hasn't been some media coverage here where the register has been cited as evidence of who is meeting with politicians. So the importance I hold is it's there for public transparency. And part of that in a practical sense for people today is really about the content, the detailed content that's provided on our register. So I'm sure some of you that are in attendance today are all too aware of getting an email from our team seeking greater detail in terms of the content provided for information returns. I mean, we want these information returns to be a useful summary of the details of your engagement with politicians, etc. And what use is a register if it doesn't provide a sense of what individuals are being lobbied about? And that's been our aim right from the start. We want the register to be meaningful. Billy mentioned there we're almost 4 years down the line of the register being operational, and that's close to 20,000 published information returns of regulated lobbying. It's not a numbers game, but I mean, that is a great deal of information that is out there now for public consumption that wasn't visible prior to the register being available. And I suppose one final point in this too is that it also works the other way. I guess the register could just as easily be used to look for where there might be gaps in terms of people thinking that X company should have registered something as Y person was seen talking to AN other MSP. So that in itself, again, just to tie that up, provides another element of transparency in a roundabout way.
Okay. Thank you, James. I think really useful and yeah, gosh, so much information there. I wonder if we start with a big question to kick off the discussion. I'd be really interested to hear all of your opinions on what you see as the biggest ethical challenges facing us today in 2022. And Izzy, I don't know if you want to start us.
Yeah. Sure. So in the first half of the 20th century, there was a famous French philosopher called Michel Foucault who coined the term knowledge is power. And power reproduces knowledge by shaping it in accordance with its anonymous intentions. And you could argue that that is very much a part of public relations and all forms of communication. Today, big data is regarded as the means to generate useful knowledge and power. And so you could say that big data is probably one of the biggest ethical challenges that we have at the moment.
Absolutely. Thank you, Izzy. Billy, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. I mean, John, I think I'd probably turn it a little bit on its head and look at the register that James has just been discussing. I mean, I think it's important to say that in any discussion of ethics that the register itself wasn't set up in Scotland because of a scandal. You know, it was set up there, so we now have a system which records face-to-face lobbying, including video conferences, and that has to be declared online. So as James has mentioned, and I'm sure it's preying on everybody's mind, there's definitely some issues around other jurisdictions and certainly issues around what's wider than the current legislation covers. But I think the register itself is actually one transparency measure which you can point to, which helps to reinforce high standards. And I think the fact that it's just there and it's on a legal footing is actually a great thing in terms of how you can point to your ethical standards in your sectors. There's also processes, as James touched on, in a legal framework to challenge, you know, alleged missing or inaccurate information, which again keeps the bar high in terms of fully reporting on what are eligible activities. I mean, there's arguments, and will continue to be arguments about what should be eligible and what shouldn't. But I think looking back over 4 years in terms of ethics, the register has started to make a contribution to that, which you yourselves as contributors can point to.
Thank you, Billy. James, I don't know if you have anything to add on that one.
Very slightly. I mean, just in terms of, again, thinking of what the register is used for and the information returns that we have. I mean, honesty is one of the things I think about when it comes to ethics. And in terms of an information return, we think information returns are always better and more honest sounding when organisations will really be specific about what it is that they're saying. There's no need to hide what you're lobbying. I mean, I think it's a legitimate practice. So if you're engaging with the register, be specific, tell us what you are. People want to read what you're doing.
I guess there might be some people in our audience today who aren't so familiar with the regulations that are in place around that. Like, what is actually regulated by the lobbying register? Yeah.
Well, for those that are familiar with the Act, I mean, nothing has changed since it came into force, but what regulating lobbying is, for those that don't know, is oral face-to-face lobbying of MSPs, Scottish Government ministers, special advisors, and one civil servant covered by the Act. That's the Permanent Secretary. And it would be where someone is paid to represent your organisation and is using the opportunity to inform or influence those individuals on behalf of the organisations. Now, there are a number of exemptions that need to be considered with regards to your organisation, limited to things, not limited just to things such as small organisation exemptions or constituency exemptions or even being unpaid for that. So there are exemptions within the Act. But organisations, they have a responsibility to ensure that it maintains compliance and it must submit declarations of its regulated lobbying activities or a nil return for each of their statutory periods. So these periods are 6 monthly and they start from the date of application where an organisation joins the register. Now, there's a failure to comply, and where that happens, that's a breach of the Act. And I think Billy may wish to add a little more here, maybe just now or further down the line, about what might be construed here as breaches and potential for ethical misconduct.
I'd be interested to hear that. No, that would be good. Billy, I don't know if you want to cover that now.
I mean, there are it's a free tier system really essentially in place in Scotland for what I would call willful misbehaviour. What James and I and the team cover is mistaken behaviour, if I can put it politely, where people forget to put returns in and or have difficulties in taking forward what they should do under the Act, which does make it an offence for things not to be submitted on time. But there's higher standards of offence, if you like, for willful misbehaviour. So I mean, I don't want to scare everybody. We've never used it, but we do have the power in the Parliament for what we call information notices, which is when we can request information from anybody we think is reasonable grounds for believing they've engaged in regulated lobbying and haven't reported it. And that's it becomes a legal process at the appeal, because the appeal could go to the Sheriff Court. And ultimately, if we don't provide that information, there's a level 3 fine, I think it's £1,000, that can be applied. The second tier, again, not going too heavy on stuff that's not really happening that much, but the Commissioner for Ethical Standards could have an investigation if there's a complaint, an eligible complaint, and that office could obviously report that to the Standards Committee in the Parliament, and the Standards Committee could then decide whether or not to sanction any organisation through a vote of parliamentarians in the Parliament. And ultimately, of course, somebody's behaving in a very bad way, then criminal sanctions would apply, and the Crown Office would be involved straight away. But just to reassure, we tend to deal with most of the stuff ourselves. I've never issued an information notice in the name of the Clerk of the Parliament yet. It's not to say we haven't considered a few, but I think that proves that the system is, in terms of ethical standards, to get back to the subject of ethics, is people are trying their hardest to work in a system which they got 3 and 3/4 years ago, and working well with us to try and largely make sure they stay on the right side of the line.
Yep. Gosh, so many potential risks there, but yeah, as you say, good that it's very few and far between. Izzy, I'm interested to get your take. I guess that gives us a good idea of kind of the public affairs space in Scotland, but what do you see as the biggest ethical risks right now in the kind of broader communications industry?
I think one of the biggest challenges, and it's not a new thing, is ability to control and monitor and police what's happening ethically within the PR industry. Although we have got professional bodies like the CIPR and the PRCA, unlike medicine or law, you can't be prevented from practicing PR unless you're part of a professional body. You could be thrown out of the professional body, but there isn't the same ability to regulate the profession. And I think that's an ongoing challenge for it in terms of the codes of conduct and trying to get people to adhere to those principles. Combined with broader issues, many of them are digital data related, GDPR, data protection, cyber security. We're going to talk later about deep fakes and digital technology and the impact that has, and of course social media and the dilution of truth versus fact, blurred lines, all of that. I think there's some significant challenges, but also opportunities as well.
Yeah. The policing of it is such an interesting one, and I guess the CIPR has its code of conduct, but as you say, whilst there might be a kind of public disgrace if someone was to be asked to leave the body, it's not necessarily a ban from practicing. And yeah, so maybe we start off, because I'm quite interested in this topic of truth decay, this phenomenon at the moment, apparently, a blurring of the line between opinion and fact. What do you think the PR industry can do to tackle that information? Do you think there's more that we can do to defend the truth?
Yes, I do. And actually, interestingly, I think part of it is adopting more of a journalistic mindset, which is fact-checking, checking your sources, checking and double-checking where the information and the material has come from, and trying to proactively counter misinformation where it appears as well. And obviously not deliberately producing misinformation would be some of the things that we can do.
Do you think there's an added challenge at the moment? I mean, closed platforms like WhatsApp are, increasingly becoming the Wild West of fake news, according to some media sources. It seems to be, in the news quite a lot at the moment.
Closed platforms are a challenge because obviously they're harder to penetrate with fact, and you can't determine necessarily who's in them or what material is being shared within them, but we do know that they can be very harmful. When they are exposed, the Metropolitan Police down in London with the WhatsApp group, which was misogynistic, exposing various significant issues there. But what that also tells us is it is possible to expose what's happening. It's not completely invisible. So I don't know if I call it the Wild West necessarily, but I would also want to try and draw attention that open platforms can also be problematic ethically as well, not just closed platforms.
Thank you, Izzy. And you mentioned as well, maybe I'm going to stick with you for just a little bit longer if that's okay, and ask about data, because I know that it's often said data is one of the world's most valuable commodities. And I wonder, do you think we'll see a toughening of UK restrictions when it comes to data?
Yes and no, precisely because it is a commodity. It's the new oil, as it's often referred to, so it's hugely profitable. So for that reason, there won't be a straightforward case of regulating it in the way that some people would like. But we know it's also potentially hugely damaging. Perhaps a good analogy is the way that oil has been damaging to the planet through global warming. One wonders what effect that data will have on global society, on politics, and indeed is already having on global society and politics. And we just need to look at Russia and Ukraine and how data is being manipulated and communication is being used to further specific agendas.
And I wonder, kind of staying with regulation, Billy and James, do you think there will be a tightening up of regulation in your space as well? Do you think we're going to see more regulation to come with the lobbying register?
I'll take that one, yeah. I mean, it's hard to say. There's always, as I said, these conversations around whether or not we should extend the communications, etc., the levels of people who are covered by the lobbying register. I mean, lobbying registers throughout the world have different standards set, and it's the policymakers, not James or I, who would make the decisions on whether to do that. I mean, take Ireland, for example, it has more communications in it. It goes down to a level of what they call DPOs. So, it's not just the one civil servant that James mentioned earlier in that act. So these are things that the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee had considered in its 2-year review since the Act came into force. And I think it was largely felt that even though there was some things that we'd expressed and stakeholders had expressed about the exemptions in the Act that were introduced quite late on in its passage, that we should probably wait until after the committee had done its review to do any legislative change. And the committee did report last March. It's been a while coming, but obviously with COVID, I think there's been issues around. I mean, I'm not responsible for the review or how to take it forward. But I do think the Standards Committee is now actively looking at it in terms of the report that the committee had asked to be done, an independent assessment of the impact on organisations, the transparency that the register's created, and looking at the communications, as I mentioned, and levels that could or could not be brought forward in the future. But with any parliamentary committee, they'd obviously consult people first and take evidence again, I'm sure, before taking any steps forward. So I think it's a case of watch this space. I think COVID's probably intervened a little bit.
Yeah. And has that been a challenge? Because I know that James obviously spoke about the fact that it's face-to-face that's covered currently. Has that been a challenge during the pandemic where communication had changed so much?
I'll take this one. I mean, what's happened here, as an example, if you take March 2020 as the point where things changed for everybody, prior to that, we only had 3 published returns which detailed regulated lobbying by video conferencing facilities. But now, if you look at the register, as I mentioned, there's around 20,000 published returns. I think we're about 100 short of 3,000 of those returns now being by video conferencing. So that's almost 15% of total published returns. And I think even as we probably do return to normality, I think the video conferencing is going to be here to stay. And although you might see a balance tipping back towards face-to-face, the rate of returns in terms of lobbying in person, I think the ability to be able to carry out lobbying and informing or influencing from your office or at home, as we're all probably doing today, it's going to remain popular. I think it's here to stay now. And I suppose one other consideration in the factor is for businesses, it must be cheaper to have your people sitting at home and be able to get in front of people over video rather than having to travel.
Thank you. We've got our first question through from the audience, so I'm gonna ask that one, and it might be a tough one, I don't know, and it's for Billy and James, and it's about the scandals that have hit Westminster and just whether we anticipate that something similar could happen in Scotland, and if it did, would it be covered?
Yeah, I mean, the current regulations, the current legislation covers face-to-face and video conferences. So I can't comment beyond that. I mean, a lot of the stuff around Westminster was to do with stuff that doesn't fit within our remit. I mean, a lot of it is to do with people leaving government jobs and then lobbying, the COBA stuff, the cabinet appointments in business is one of the big issues that was down there. Whether or not people should be able to lobby, to be in office, and have to go in front of the committee in terms of when they're allowed to then take up posts to do that. That's not within our remit. That's within the Ministerial Code of the Scottish Government. I don't think it's probably a big thing. I don't know. There's not as much of a churn of former MPs, for example, in Westminster, and you take the amount of MPs and the amount of peers down there, it's a lot more than there is in the 129 Scottish MSPs, so there's probably not a magnitude scale there. I mean, the other aspect that came out is just the forms of communication down south and how people have been using it, and they're not covered just now, and that might be something that policymakers will have an eye on when they get to that kind of type of review. I can't predict that. I'm not the policymaker, but so we'd be able to advise committees on how best to introduce anything if that's what their wish was.
Thank you, Billy. It'll be interesting to see, if it diversifies in terms of the forms of comms in the future. Izzy, I wonder if we can come back to you, and I've got a question here, which is, what advice can you provide for PR practitioners who find themselves in a difficult ethical dilemma? For example, telling a client that you can't represent them due to a difference in professional or moral values. We all know that taking an ethical stance can sometimes have big consequences. What advice do you have for people in that situation?
Gosh, I wish there was an easy answer to that one, Sean. And for most of us who have ever been in that position, it's incredibly difficult. If you look at what the literature says around this, they talk about the moral role of the PR practitioner. And of course, that can be quite a subjective thing, and it may even vary depending on the issue that you're dealing with. But perhaps one of the most useful approaches came from Stephen Fitzpatrick, who basically said there's 4 different duties ethically that a PR practitioner has. The first is to yourself and your own moral code. And if what you're being asked to do is unacceptable to you as an individual, as difficult as it might be, you may have to ask that question, do I want to work for this person or not? And it's how far you're willing to go to compromise on that. But it's not just your own moral code. If you are employed, you also have a duty to the code of ethics that your client or your organization might have as well. And so you have a responsibility to know what that is and to factor that into your ethical decision making as well. Thirdly, you have your duty to the profession. So the CIPR has got a code of ethics and principles that it would like practitioners to adhere to, so we should be cognizant of that when we're making decisions. And then finally, Stephen Fitzpatrick talked about your duty to society, and of course that can vary geographically, geopolitically, what those societal expectations and codes of ethics might be, and they're certainly not the same all over the world. And so as PR practitioners, we need to understand what the specific societal ethical expectations are too. So there's a lot of different needs to weigh up there when you are faced with those kind of predicaments. But ultimately, I would argue it comes down to you and what you're prepared to do.
Great. And I don't know if there's anything you can recommend around kind of any theory in this space that's worth reading. It sounds like that's definitely one to check out. Is there anything else that you would kind of recommend as further reading for people listening today?
Yes, there's lots of really good cortex and Stephen Fitzpatrick. I'd probably send you some links. Would that be helpful at the end? Some references.
Yeah, that would be great. We can send those round.
There's a textbook called Exploring Public Relations, which has a really good chapter on ethics as well, which is where this Stephen Fitzpatrick model has been adapted from. So yeah, it's probably best if I just give you some references at the end, Sean, and that'll make it easier for people to locate.
Yeah, perfect. We're starting to get quite a few questions through now, and just as a build on that point, Izzy, we have a question here that says, to what extent do you believe PR professionals have power to challenge line managers and clients effectively when faced with an ethical dilemma?
Again, it's a very difficult one. It can vary depending on how PR is perceived within the organisation. So if PR is occupying what we would describe as a management role or function with the organisation, in the way that we would understand it, being able to perform situational analysis and advise management on appropriate courses of action, it might be easier to highlight what the consequences of unethical behaviour might be in terms of public perception and therefore reputation, and the impact of reputation on the bottom line. So if PR is valued and regarded in that way, it should be easier. However, if public relations is seen as a more tactical role, i.e. producing content on demand for specific things, and it's not seen in that sort of advisory managerial type role, it could be much more difficult to get that point of view across. Some people say that much of it comes down to the individual and their persuasive abilities and their ability to form relationships with the people that ultimately make those decisions.
Do you think the stakes have been raised by comms people having much more of a place at the boardroom table, I suppose, in some ways, perhaps?
Yes, I think there's definitely a responsibility for people who are occupying those positions to take an ethical approach to what they're doing and to advise organisations accordingly, and to adhere to the kind of principles which underpin. If you look at all the professional codes of conduct and the literature around this, that the underpinning ideas or principles are mutual trust and understanding, openness, honesty and transparency, and serving the public interest as priorities. And these are actually hallmarks of most professions. So to be regarded as a profession, we should be doing those things. And public interest versus private interest can be a difficult balancing act sometimes.
I'm sure Billy and James are quite familiar with that one. Public versus private, yeah. I've got another question through, which is actually for Billy and James, and it goes back to an earlier point just about the video conferencing. Someone's asked, given that is likely to stay, is there an opportunity to digitize the documentation in these meetings? Is it likely in the future that we might see someone filling in a form? Or instead of that, could they potentially record the entire call and submit the video in full?
I'll jump in first, Billy, in this one. Well, I mean, first things first, I guess you would need the buy-in from the participant, and I don't know if you would get the political buy-in from that, but in terms of really from a practical point of view, we at this moment in time, we don't have the IT infrastructure which would allow such a type of submission to be made to the lobbying register. The only thing I would suggest there again would be, if you were to record the call, it might be the easiest way of being able to recollect exactly what it was that was said in the meeting and what it was that you would want to input in an information return form in the sort of the traditional way that happens just now. But yeah, at this moment in time, I don't know if that would be likely to be possible.
Yeah, I mean, it would require a change in the legislation. But I think it's interesting. We should always keep in mind new technologies and new ways of working in terms of how legislation can change in the future. I mean, just now, and the emphasis is on an information return is it's a very short summary of what you actually discussed. It's not meant to be a hindrance or anything particularly difficult to fill in. It should just be a very short, accurate what you lobbied on. I think policymakers should be open to ideas about how we can make clear information available publicly. But I think James's thought there was a good one. We're recording this, for example. It's a way to recollect what was discussed. And sometimes we have issues with people who can't quite remember exactly the detail. I think you'll probably have a good idea of what you're getting into. If you've set up a meeting with a minister, I'd expect you to have an idea about what it is you wanted to lobby them on, and hopefully at the end of it have an idea of what you actually did lobby them on. But that's all useful stuff in terms of recollecting. Our interest is just getting you to provide the public with the basic information about what has actually happened during an engagement or communication with politicians.
And is there a challenge there? Because I guess for people that work in that space, often the focus is on building relationships over a long period of time with these elected representatives. Like, where do we define the line between having a conversation with an MSP or minister and regulated lobbying? Is there, how does that work? Where's the line?
Yeah, I would say there that ultimately that's something for you as individuals and in deliberation with your organisation to define that line, certainly in a regulated sense. Relationship building must be an essential part of your work, and our Act isn't meant to prohibit that. It's just about making sure you have that awareness that any conversation that you're likely to have, regardless of the setting, might end up being registrable. Billy just touched on it there, but we would assume that there's always a reason for seeking those meetings with MSPs, or why you're delivering a presentation in the garden lobby, or there's a stall set up in the exhibition hall. So even the impromptu conversations that you might have in the train station, walking down the Royal Mile, or even in the pub. If you must be aware where your relationship is and where that line crosses. And where we go with that is really to think about the first point would be the 5 key steps that we come at this purely from the administrative point of view. You think about, did you seek to use the opportunity to inform or influence on behalf of the organisation? Did you take your sort of your individual hat on here off and put on your, right, okay, I'm at work now. So it's really about that. We're not in the call when these communications take place, so we can advise, but we can't adjudicate. So yeah, for me, it's really down to you'll know better whether that line has been crossed, I would say.
And how far is that interrogated? Because you mentioned at the start that sometimes you will go back and ask for additional info to be shared.
Yeah.
Are there cases where you...
So what we do, the information return comes in off the back of a conversation or a communication that's been made. And Billy, again, might have touched on this, but the things that we want you to consider about what was it you raised, what was it you were trying to get across, be that yourself or what you or others from the organisation were saying. You must know what you were seeking to achieve and what to ask for. So that's where we want to know, whether that be a direct sort of question that you're asking, whether you're looking for funding or whatever, or even if you're almost laying breadcrumbs indirectly for MSPs or ministers to think about your point of view that you're putting across. That's what I would say.
John, the way I would express it is, if you're a person and a member of the public, and we all are, and you're reading the register, can you understand what the lobbying was by reading that purpose of the lobbying box? That's the key box we look for. And as James said, it's about, what you've had a meeting, you've had a discussion. It's more difficult, I guess, in impromptu conversations to figure that out. But we should be able to establish that and put a return in if you think you've engaged. And you're looking at things like the outcomes you were seeking, the kind of issues and policies that you raised. And quite often we see returns coming in which are very short, but we know find out from watching the telly the night before. There's a lot more to So it's already public information. So I think all we're really looking for is that, a brief summary of all the points that can be considered as, as James says, informative influence in the MSP or the minister or the special advisor or the permanent secretary. That's kind of what we're after. And I'm not saying it's an easy science, but we try and work with everybody to try and be clear and be consistent about that. But the simplest test is just read it.
It sounds like, yeah, there are definitely some useful points there around things to consider and also some questions to ask yourself as a practitioner. I wonder if we stay on that theme actually, and Izzy, I'd be really keen to get your thoughts on any other questions that we should be asking ourselves when it comes to ethical dilemmas as practitioners.
I think the main question that we should be asking is, will this action I'm about to take hurt anyone or hurt anything? And if the answer is yes, then we should be perhaps reconsidering what we're about to do. If we're not sure, then we should be consulting other people to try and be sure about that. And sometimes it's not always clear cut. Sometimes it is difficult. So my go-to place would be the CIPR principles, ethical principles, the fundamental openness, honesty, transparency mantra that we should be adhering to. Making sure that in all the dealings with all the different stakeholders that we have every day, including the media, that we maintain the highest standards of professional endeavour and integrity, confidentiality, and so on. That we remember that employees inside the organisation are also important in this ethical mix as well. And that we really just need to take all reasonable care to ensure that we are trying to serve the public interest and do what's right and not harmful in any way. But by knowing what the CIPR principles are, by knowing what the regulatory frameworks are and making it our business to stay up to date with those things, there's a better chance that we will make the right ethical decision, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think most practitioners probably, work very hard to make sure that they do stick within those ethics. And I think despite that, though, there's still a challenge, isn't there, with the perception of the industry. And, the stuff that makes the news is probably where it all goes quite wrong. There is a scandal, and it's maybe the same for Billy and James as well. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts, Izzy, on what is the media's view of PR professionals when it comes to ethics?
Yeah, so yesterday we were very fortunate at RGU to have an online guest lecture from no other than Laura Koonsberg. And she was talking very candidly about her job and her role for our journalism students and our PR students. And one of the students asked about how people try to influence the news agenda. And she did mention PR industry as being one of the ways that people try to influence the news agenda and what's going on. And I think what you find with the relationship between PR and the news media, the traditional news media, is a really kind of codependent, slightly fraught relationship where they both need each other. And the media now more than ever need PR for content 24/7, 365 days a year on multiple platforms. But equally, journalism is about finding the truth and exposing unethical practice where it occurs and trying to filter and check the sources and find alternative sources rather than take everything at face value that might be presented to them, potentially through a press release or other. There are a range of relationships, and the overriding school of thought is that you shouldn't take an adversarial approach with the media, that you should try and work with them and recognise that actually the media are an extremely important communication tool. For you and for your employer and for your client. But it really can range from very friendly indeed to very adversarial, depending on the situation and the people involved.
Thank you, Izzy. And Billy and James, have you found that similarly the lobbying register is really only mentioned in relation to kind of the negative headlines, or do you think there is a kind of public awareness of this as a resource?
I think it probably could be larger, but I think maybe expectations of a register were that it would be more topical. So it's not a resource for necessarily for journalists to go and find out information immediately. I think we have seen journalists use it effectively for investigative type work, and you'll see that the register is quite often quoted as part of a newspaper story, which will talk about freedom of information requests and what's on the lobbying register, etc. But as James mentioned earlier on, there's 6 months from the date in which you register to then have a cycle of returns. So we encourage people to submit returns more regularly, just to keep it topical, but there's no legislative requirement to do so. So it's really up to individual organisations how they wish to manage that. It was something that came up in the review, and the committee were minded to go towards a more quarterly, or certainly a more regular basis. I think quarterly is what they said. So that might happen, I don't know. If they do that, I think because we gave evidence to the committee and this question was raised, I think we said that we'd like to see harmonisation of dates. So just now, it's administratively quite complex for journalists and others to understand when somebody's reporting deadlines are. So take Ireland, for example, again, as our nearest kind of comparison. It's got it reports 3 times a year and everybody reports on the same date. So I think if the politicians decide to go down the route of a more regular reporting cycle, I think it would make sense to have harmonisation of dates, and that's something I can say because it's something we actually asked for at the committee.
Interesting change, yeah. I'm conscious of time. I've got a few questions that I thought would be worth wrapping up on, but I think we might have had another through the Q&A, so bear with me 1 second. A question for Izzy here. If we take the extreme Netflix drama type example of dirty money and dirty lobbying in Scotland, the lobbyist can face a criminal sentence. However, the politician can only face a fine via the ethics committee. Should the politician be held ultimately responsible for enacting the changes, and should they face more severe consequences than the lobbyist? Goodness me.
Yeah, I don't know if I can give an authoritative answer to that one. To be honest, I don't think I have the authority to give an answer to that. But I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of how these kind of things are enforced, and the incentives for politicians to behave more ethically as well. The ability for people to regulate themselves very often is somewhat dubious. We see that with the media regulating themselves, and maybe there's always an argument at both sides for more or less regulation to be imposed in different situations. There's always an argument for fairness and equity in these situations, but I think it could be a challenge which may continue for some time, particularly if it involves politicians.
Billy and James, I don't know if there's much you can add to that, but perhaps not a direct answer to the question, but if there's anything more generally you could add.
Well, I mean, only the politicians themselves continue to look at the legislation and whether or not to change the rules around their own behaviour. I mean, I know there's an example being considered just now in the Scottish Parliament about things. So, so it's not a comment from me, but it's a comment that is, it's certainly an ongoing discussion that is worth looking out for.
Yeah. There's another question through for you actually, just on who is using the information in the lobbying register, like from the public, and what reasons do they tend to actually use it for?
I mean, we don't know exactly who's using it. I mean, how much public consumption there is of the register. I mean, one of the things that I can't think of is interest groups, certainly depending on a lot of topical things that are going through right now. I would say, as an example, for, say, the Gender Reform Act, and obviously quite an emotive subject on both sides. So, and again, we can maybe look at this and how it ties in with the FOI Act, and people maybe submitting freedom of information requests, looking at what they've received back there, and almost trying to compare and contrast with what is on the register and what isn't. So, yeah, that would be my kind of thought on who might be using it to depending on their point of view and what they want to find out, is it or isn't happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are missing some information about public use, and I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that it can sometimes be a bit complex in terms of figuring out how things work, and it obviously only covers face-to-face lobbying. So some people some members of the public want to know about all types of lobbying, including lobbying by individuals, and maybe their expectations are higher than what the lobbying register could ever provide. But I do agree with James. I mean, we have seen a lot of interest, almost paternal interest, navel gazing, if you like, and looking across to see what others are doing from different sectors. Things like deposit return scheme, any major policy that comes through, we tend to see a corresponding number of returns. So in that way, I think we can map it against the policy agendas that are going through the Parliament, or legislation. I mean, the planning bill is massive. It covered a whole bunch of things, and we've seen an awful lot of returns because of that coming through on different aspects of the planning bill. So yeah, there's a reflection there, but I would like to see more public use of it. It's something that I think we would want to look at, and again, the review, I'm sure, will, as I mentioned, we'll look at that, kind of what impact it's had.
We've probably got time for just a couple of more questions. Izzy, I wonder if I can put one to you, which you have slightly touched on. Do you think ethics have become even more important in the digital world? And as communicators, what could we do to uphold ethical practice more online?
So I think it's taking the time to check the accuracy of information, to take responsibility to ensure that what you are putting out is factually accurate and correct, to use the tools that are available to monitor what's happening and obtain an accurate picture of what your audiences, your consumers, your publics are thinking and feeling. PR has the ability to act as a conscience for an organization, and looking at social media often can tell you almost like a temperature gauge of what people are thinking and feeling and how they're perceiving what your organization is doing. And so it's a really important way actually of informing management within the organization of public perception and what should be done about it, for good or for bad. So it's a lot of work to do it well, and it can be done well and it can be done badly, but it has potential to be very useful for PR practitioners in terms of fulfilling their advisory role, definitely, for management.
Thank you. So I've got a final question for you all, and maybe we can just go around each person. But as it's Global Ethics Month, what one thing should we all be doing today to be more ethical? And Izzy, I don't know if you want to kick us off.
I think be kind in life, but also with your communications, and remember the impact it has on real people and wider society, that it does have an impact on people and that we have a responsibility.
Thank you. James, what would be your one thing that we should all do today to be more ethical?
I mean, I started with it, so I'll end with it, and it's transparency. I think, again, purely coming from our point of view, just be upfront about what it is that you're speaking to politicians about. There's nothing to hide, I would assume. So just show us what you're saying and what you're trying to advocate for.
And Billy, same question.
Well, one of the things we worked with the CIPR on was a code of conduct for lobbying MSPs, for those of you who lobby MSPs, and I'll put a link on for that, because I think that in a nutshell sums up for me a lot of the different codes of conduct are out there, and a lot of what Izzy's covered in terms of just straightforward and honest way of how you should go about your business. And I think there's 6 points there which are very brief and cover in a nutshell what I think in terms of lobbying MSPs, at least, I think is what you should take forward.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Izzy, Billy and James, for sharing your insights today. And thank you everyone who's joined us for the session. If you are a CIPR member, remember today's event is worth 5 ethics CPD points. And I do appreciate that the issues we've discussed today are complex. We've just really scratched the surface with this conversation. And at some point in your career, you may be faced with an ethical dilemma, and sometimes the right thing to do isn't always clear. in those circumstances, we do have the CIPR's ethics helpline, which is free, it's confidential, and it's there for you to use. So again, that's another resource that you could check out. Before we close, I'd also just like to remind CIPR members that we do have a new app. It's called CIPR Connect, and it has just launched. It's got lots of news, networking, and it's also quite good for registering your CPD very quickly if you're going through that process at the moment ahead of the deadline. The CIPR Scotland will be back with another event next month, so keep an eye out on our channels. We've got the CIPR.scot website and also our Twitter account as well. But in the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you at another CIPR Scotland event very soon. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Log it off. Nice to see you, Izzy.
You too. You too.
Thank you. I was just going to come in there to say thanks so much. Sorry, I've got COVID, so I'm sitting here quietly and haven't said an awful lot, but I really appreciate your input there. It was great.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, we'll see you again soon. Cheers.
Thanks.
Thanks.